Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Science or Fiction podcast, the podcast where we interview experts to separate the science from the fiction in news headlines. I'm your host, Dr. Catherine Bates. I'm a Youth Development and Mental Health Research Fellow based at King's College London, and this is the Science or Fiction podcast. Mental health, climate science, ethnicity, LGBTQ, disability, inequality, gender, the elderly, and women. These make up just 10 of the 200 terms that are now banned from research funded by the US. And it's not just research that's happening in the US, but in other countries that receive US funding. The National Institute of Health, which funds billions of dollars of medical research, has already pulled funding from thousands of grants, including projects on discrimination in healthcare and LGBTQ+ teen health. Diversity, equity and inclusion programs have also been terminated. Several companies have dropped diversity targets, and scholarships to support people from marginalised communities have been cancelled. This isn't just about limiting what science can study, it's about who gets to do the science in the first place. This month, I spoke to Professor Christina Pargle, a Professor of Operational Research at University College London, and the author of a new report, How Diversity Makes Science Better, to understand the full impact of these restrictions and why diversity is important in science. So, welcome to the podcast, Christina. Thanks for coming.
Thank you for having me.
So we'll start with the research, and then it would be great to talk about a report that you've just published. How will this actually affect research? Is the research stopping overnight, or are people able to just kind of change terminology and still operate? Is anyone refusing to make these changes?
So I don't know about people refusing to make those changes. I think if you work for the federal government in the US, you don't have a choice, as in you do it or you get fired. And if you're the recipient of a grant from the federal government, you don't have a choice either. So I know of people who've just had their grants cancelled. And what that means is that there's no money to pay the postdoctoral researcher or the PhD student, and they lose their jobs and the funding ends. Some of the really destructive things that have happened because of the NIH bans is that some of them were clinical trials where people were having treatments tested on them and they've just had to stop, which is unethical, really, because those people were receiving treatment. And it also would mean that all the results collected today, like you can't really use them, and you haven't finished that work. So it is really devastating. I think just in terms of trying to stop people really thinking about research into inequalities or differences by gender or differences by ethnicity is damaging. It's damaging for human health. I mean, just take COVID, for example, right? We know that COVID was worse for men, and we know that long COVID primarily, it's more likely to affect women. We know that some diseases affect different ethnicities. So sickle cell disease affects people of a Black ethnicity more, right? And if you don't track those kinds of things, if you don't put money and resources and research time and science into thinking about what those things mean, you're not going to come up with effective treatments at all. I mean, it's just so damaging.
The abruptness of it is quite scary. So the fact that clinical trials have literally stopped overnight and people are kind of in the middle of treatment programs is one thing. And then, yeah, you're completely right. We can't understand human health without understanding differences or similarities across different people or individual differences, for example.
I mean, just on the basis of it, some of it is just clearly a knee-jerk reaction without them thinking it through. Like, how can they possibly ban the word gender or woman, or because there are some things like, say, breast cancer or cervical cancer. Like, are we not allowed to study those now, or we have to find other ways of talking about it? I mean, it is like that side of it is ridiculous, but like this idea that caring about the impact of your work on different types of communities as bad just makes no sense to me.
Yeah. And there will be like entire institutions or departments, for example, that study women's health or breast cancer. So something like they're going to have to adapt this like blanket rule that they've put in place.
Well, you'd hope so. Or those institutions shut down. So, for instance, in Hungary, when Viktor Orban was kind of consolidating his power, he attacked the universities and science as well. And overnight, they stopped all research into gender studies. Just gone. Doesn't exist in Hungary anymore. So, yeah. Yes, those kind of things can happen. And I wouldn't be surprised if you see that happening in the US. Well, the US has already got an executive order saying there are only 2 genders assigned at birth, and that's it. So that's definitely the direction they're going in.
Let's talk about your report with Independent Sage and a bit more about the work that you do. So what obviously you were led to write this report based on what's happening, but what's the audience of the report and what is the aim? What are the main things that you cover?
So we started, so IndieSage started during the pandemic, and it was about communicating to the public about what was happening, what the policy options were around COVID. And we were very focused also on the kind of unequal impact on different communities. But we're also all scientists, and we've all still stayed in touch, although we haven't really been doing any kind of COVID work for a few years now. We're still in touch with each other, and we've all been watching what's been happening in the US. And when it became very clear from January onwards that they were attacking diversity initiatives and pressuring universities to cut all diversity initiatives that they have on the threat of losing their funding, they're cutting it in all the federal institutions, they're cutting it in science, they're trying to censor terms in science. I guess we assumed that there would be pushback. We assumed that the universities and the scientific institutions, that the journals, the academic journals, would stand up and say this is wrong, right? And make the case for why diversity matters, diversity in what you study, but also diversity in your workforce. And it just wasn't happening. And I was waiting to see just anyone make the argument about why it makes for better science, and no one was doing it. And so we wrote this. It's just 3 pages long, but we just wanted to kind of just say it. This is why we do diversity. It's not to be woke. It's not to kind of do it just because we think it's the right thing to do, although it is the right thing to do. It makes science better. It makes for better science workplace, and it makes for better scientific results. And so that's why we did it. And I guess the audience was well, I think the public, but also our colleagues, are just saying, look, let's explain why we're doing this.
You've kind of mentioned some of or you write in the report that terminating these kind of initiatives would reduce the quality of science, and you cite different evidence behind this. Can you maybe talk us through some of the evidence behind why diversity is important in science?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing to say is that science hasn't been diverse forever, right? That in Europe and America for hundreds of years, it was high status white men doing it. And the majority of Western science is still high status white men, although it's been getting a lot better. So that's the first thing to say. And then the second thing to say is that just on a fundamental level, scientific ability is not limited to white men, right? It's not that they're born with some special ability to do science. So by having a more diverse workforce and opening up, you're just massively increasing the number of people you could draw from who are incredible scientists but never got that opportunity. So that's just like the really basic thing of just having a wider pool of talent. But above that, there is evidence, plenty of evidence now that shows that having a diverse team of people, and that's diversity, gender, ethnicity, background, socioeconomic background. So it's also thinking about class, region, creates for better decision making, right? You have more perspectives to draw on. you have more potential solutions to draw on. It's a way of avoiding groupthink. And so they're kind of shown that teams that are more diverse have more innovative, higher impact work and are much better at tackling the really complex problems that actually could do with lots of different ways of trying to approach it. Unfortunately, you still find that even though they've been shown to have higher impact work, they still get rewarded less career-wise. There is those kind of implicit biases going on. Also, it changes the kinds of things that you look at. So, for instance, one of the issues with it being white men is that a lot of problems that primarily affected women have just been completely ignored until quite recently. It's been in the news a lot recently about things like endometriosis affecting 1 in 10 women. Still takes roughly 8 years to get diagnosed. There aren't that many really effective treatments. Things like period pain, menopause, all of the things have been massively under-researched because it just wasn't in people's heads. It wasn't necessarily even a deliberate, I'm not going to do that. It wasn't in part of their life experience. I mentioned sickle cell disease before, which affect primarily people of Black African descent. Now, it was a campaign by the Black Panther group in America in the 70s and 80s that actually brought this to attention, saying there are people in our community who are getting really sick and are dying. And then the first really effective treatment for sickle cell disease finally came about in 2019 because of activism. It's only in the last 10 years that people have really started to realize in the US, but especially also in the UK, that Black and Asian women are much more likely to die in childbirth and how much more likely to have a miscarriage. And we didn't know. People hadn't looked. The other thing is that when you think about who are you going to work with in terms of the communities you're working with, there's been an issue with testing medical treatments, medical trials. Most of the people they actually test it on are white men. And so that means that actually the medicines are optimized to work in white men. And what's interesting is that one of the reasons that women were excluded is because our menstrual cycle screws up the results because we have such kind of fluctuating hormones through the menstrual cycle, but actually that can really impact how different medicines work at different times of your cycle. So it's cleaner not to bother with hormonal women, right? But actually it also means that those drugs might not work as well in hormonal women. There are issues where heart attacks in women can look very different to heart attacks in men. Autism in women can look very different to autism in men, but those weren't in the textbooks. And so there's this chronic problem of women getting underdiagnosed with heart attacks. To this day, you're less likely to be correctly diagnosed with a heart attack as a woman. There have been issues in terms of a lot of medical textbooks to this day only show things on white skin. And so a lot of symptoms are shown on white skin, but they look very different in brown or black skin. And so really quite severe medical problems could be missed in Black or brown people because doctors had no experience of what that would look like. There are things about how you measure oxygen in hospital is by a light thing that kind of shines light on your finger and measures the redness. Again, it works better in white people than black people. And until you have people kind of saying, this is wrong, you have to be able to collect data by ethnicity and study data by ethnicity and care about the differences by ethnicity before you will tackle those kinds of issues. And what they've also shown is that if you have a diverse research team, if you have diverse doctors, people are more likely to take part in clinical trials. So non-white people or women, because there's more trust, and they're also more likely to trust the results of those clinical trials. And the reasons for that distrust come from the fact that historically there have been terrible abuses of power in science, where they did unconsented experiments on vulnerable minorities across the world.
So diversity is basically imperative to all science, innovation and healthcare, essentially. Like we can't can't understand people or society without it. I think it, like, in terms of diverse perspectives, it could be helpful to think about it in the sense of like scientific methods. Like, we can't use one method in science. Like, you can't use a telescope to understand people's mental health. Like, we need all these different methods to understand science, and it's the same as perspective. We can't make change and move forward without the different perspectives.
Yeah, and there's another quite interesting example just of the perspective thing is, so I don't know how much people will be aware of the Grenfell Tower disaster that happened in 2017, where there was a high-rise block of flats in London that had a devastating fire and 72 people died, and hundreds more were left kind of with long-term impact, and everybody got displaced from home. And when they actually looked at, they offered kind of trauma counselling, grief counselling, but they were finding it wasn't really having an impact, and people didn't really want to engage. And so they did a whole bit of work working with the community to understand what the issue was. And a lot of it was that different people coming from different backgrounds and different cultures have different ways of grieving and different ways of talking about their grief. And they were being approached with this very British way. For instance, there's absolutely no discussion of religion and how in how trauma counselling is often given here, whereas actually for a lot of cultures that was a really important part of how they grieved. There was also quite different expectations around how men or women would grieve, and so they completely redesigned the service around giving people a variety of different options that would allow them to access the support that they needed, which was really successful. But that's kind of what I mean, is that you can't just come in with this one approach fits all ethos. It just doesn't work.
Yeah. And things are much more effective when you include the expertise of the people that you're trying to help or understand as well, right?
Yeah.
So let's move on to something hopeful. I must say that all of this happened while I was on annual leave, and I was really happy to come back and turn my emails on and have like the usual emails about diversity and inclusion practices and programs that were going on in my university. So there's a slight relief. But what can we do, I guess, especially outside of the US, to ensure that diversity remains central to science? Like, that is a huge question, but basically, how do we need to react, like, as scientists and the public, to what's going on right now?
So I think in the UK, I would say that the diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives are still a really core part of science and of universities. Certainly, whenever I apply for a grant, I have to discuss what the equity implications are, and there is a clear expectation that if you're in a position to try and tackle inequalities, that you will do that as part of your research. So I think that is a really positive change. We always have to show how we've included the public and patients and families in our work, and that basically this kind of old style paternalistic way of going about science just is gone. That said, you still see issues where some sciences are very male dominated, particularly physics, mathematics, computer science, engineering, and that hasn't really changed that much in 20-30 years since I was doing my undergrad, and that I find it quite depressing. And part of the issue is that it starts really young. It starts from school. So, if you talk to children 6-7 years old, they don't really see differences, say, by gender or ethnicity in terms of what they can do in terms of science. But by the time you're 10, 11, 12, people start associating certain fields with men, certain fields with women, or they just say that's not for me. And it's not just about role modeling, it's about how you get treated in school. It's about teachers saying this is the boy subject, or you need a boy brain, or it's not cool for a girl to be good at maths, or not cool to be good at physics, or that it's not for the likes of you. And that can also be very kind of class based. Like I went to a talk recently by someone, and they said it's like you're in a cold climate and no one's giving you a jumper. And it's not these kind of overt things saying you're not allowed to do this, but it's just being a bit hostile. And so that gradually people drop out of the system, and it starts really young. And I think that is incredibly sad. And I also think there's a big misconception in school pupils around what science is and what it's like. And I think that's a real shame. So I do actually quite a lot of, I used to do a lot of school outreach, because it's amazing. You know, it's really interesting. It's exciting. You get to study, choose what you study, choose the things that really matter to you, and you can really make a difference, right? And I would love it if we had, you know, many more people come into a science career.
Yeah. Do we have to start early with schools and with education? I did some data collection in schools and worked with schools when I was doing my PhD, and they were told like a brain scientist was coming, and they were definitely very surprised to see me after that introduction. And also I completely resonate with those with that suggestion of school. If you'd have said to me as a 10-year-old that you would be a scientist, that would not have made sense to me at all. I didn't kind of come into science or even understand that I could have this kind of job until I was way into my undergraduate degree. It was kind of an accident that I became a scientist. I would never have imagined it. So yeah, I agree. It's really important.
When I was studying, maybe a fifth of the year were girls. In my college, you know, there was 2 of us. All my teachers were men. When I did my postgraduate, I was the only girl doing a PhD in space physics. I was the only girl doing an MSc in quantum theory. And it does kind of wear on you. You just like, oh, you know.
It's like a constant battle instead of like feeling like you're welcome in a space, right?
And I kind of have a kind of personality that was kind of like, well, I'm just going to do it. I'm just going to do it. I don't care. But then I just think of all those people who are probably much better scientists than me, who just had a slightly different type of personality or had a much worse experience and just left. And I just think, what a waste. What a waste. You know, and that's what I think the issue is with not thinking about DEI and thinking, oh, it's just rubbish or it's just work. I'm like, no, you're wasting talent and you're wasting potential.
Yeah. So keep inspiring and being encouraging to younger generations, and continuing, I guess, to implement it in our science, like while we still can, is a really depressing phrase, but you know, while we have that ability to and the responsibility to.
Yeah, and I would say, you know, that if you're still in school, or if you're at university and you're doing projects or you're doing teamwork, then have a look who's in your team. Is everyone like you? And maybe think about, well, maybe we should get some different types of people in. And I think people will be surprised by how often you're like, oh, I never thought of that. And that to me is the best part of my job. It's talking to people who have completely different expertise to me, different experiences. And then they'll say something and I was like, oh my God, that would never have occurred to me in a million years. And it's so exciting. You suddenly feel like, oh my God, I've got all these new ideas now that are coming because of that. And you really spark off each other. And that's the wonder of research to me, is that kind of melding of minds, of different minds, to come up with better science.
Yeah, brilliant. I think that might be a nice, like, hopeful message to end on. So yeah, shall we wrap up there? Is there anything else that you want to add, or you think that we could kind of take the opportunity to make a point that we've like missed?
I think the only thing I would say is that the research is also showing that when it comes to improving diversity and equity in science or anything else, often the work has been left to the marginalized people. Like often it's the women who are expected to do it. It's the non-white people who are expected to do that work. and you need everybody to do it, and it needs, and people talk about being an ally, but it does matter. And I've really benefited from very supportive men in my career as much as I have from supportive women, and I think everybody needs to support that effort, is what I would say.
Yeah, it's everybody's responsibility. And I guess we can all think about the small ways that we can do it. Like it's not everybody's place to submit a grant researching inequality or something, for example. Like you can think about the small ways in your own team or in your own like day-to-day job that you can think about different ways to include different perspectives, or to encourage people, or to like help give them a platform, for example.
Yeah, exactly.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for coming today and talking us through your report and the evidence. It's a really important topic to cover.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks again to Christina for joining us today, and thank you all for listening. As always, you can find links to the research that we discussed and more information on our website, scienceorfiction.co.uk. Make sure you subscribe to the newsletter on the website and get the latest episode in your inbox on the first Monday of the month, and you'll find updates from us in those newsletters as well. If you want to get in touch or you have a suggestion for a future topic, you can email us info@scienceorfiction.co.uk or DM us on social media. Thank you to the Young Person Advisory Groups for their input on this series, to Kit Studio for the branding, and to Jamie Johnson for the music. See you next time.